In the year 1844, Ferdinand Christian Bauer, a professor at the University of Tübingen in Germany, wrote an article in the Tübinger Jahrbuch in which he applied a particular philosophical construct to the New Testament. What he applied was Hegelian dialectic. Now, Hegelian dialectic is what we all know as thesis, antithesis, synthesis. This famous construct was produced by his professor, Professor Hegel, at the University of Tübingen. And essentially what happens is when you have one idea and then you have an opposite idea, those two interact with each other, and finally you get a synthesis that merges out of that. F.C. Bauer applied Hegelian dialectic to the New Testament in this respect. He said there was a Jewish school of Christianity, represented especially in the Apostle Peter, and then a Gentile form of Christianity, especially represented in the Apostle Paul. And these two interacted with each other, fought each other, and then what merged out of that was a synthesis that was palatable both to Jewish Christians and to Gentile Christians. And the way he applied this was he said the Gospel of John doesn't seem to be exactly from the Jewish school or exactly from the Gentile school, nor does the book of Acts. And so these books he dated much, much later than scholars up until that time had dated them. F.C. Bauer applied Hegelian dialectic to the New Testament, and he came to the conclusion that John's Gospel could not have been written any earlier than AD 160 and was probably written about 170. Now, by so doing, effectively that said there's nothing in John's Gospel that's historically credible, and it certainly wasn't written by John the Apostle. That view held sway for almost 90 years in continental scholarship until the year 1934, when a student by the name of Colin H. Roberts was studying at the University of Manchester, and he was rummaging around in the John Rylands library and came across a papyrus fragment that changed from that point on how we viewed John's Gospel. What it is a papyrus fragment no larger than the palm of my hand. It's about 2.5 inches by 3.5 inches. And Roberts, who became one of the great papyrologists of the 20th century, saw this fragment, and he noticed that on one side it had John chapter 18, verses 31 through 33 on it. On the back side, it had John chapter 18, verses 37 and 38. Well, one of the things this told him is that this papyrus was a papyrus codex, not a papyrus scroll. A scroll is where it's written just on the inside, and you roll it up, and then you get to the end, and there you have the back of it. But a papyrus codex is written on both sides, and so here was the text, John 18, on both sides of this, just different verses. That told him that the manuscript was written on a codex. We know from research that has been done, especially by Roberts and a fellow at the British Library, T.C. Skeat, that the codex was something that the Christians popularized early on. They probably did not invent it, but it was popularized by them, and it was in use as early as the 90s of the first century. And so the codex form of book, which is what we have today, bound on the left side, and you have the pages that flip, and you can see text on both sides, is something that the Christians popularized through the first 5 centuries AD, and then finally the rest of the world caught up and began to use the codex. It was about the only time in the history of the church where Christians were ahead of the technological curve. But Roberts discovers this manuscript, and he says, by my reckoning, this looks pretty darn early. And he sent photographs of it to the 3 leading papyrologists in Europe at the time, and each one of them independently wrote back to him and said, I believe that this manuscript should not be dated any later than AD 150 and as early as AD 100. A fourth wrote back and disagreed with these 3 and said, I think it should be dated into the 90s of the first century. Well, here's a copy of the Gospel of John that's dated no later than 150, while F.C. Bauer had argued that the original text of John was dated no earlier than 160. Now, the way I was taught in school was that, generally speaking, the copies of a document are not written before the original of that document. So here was a fragment, just a small piece of papyrus that sent tons of continental scholarship to the flames by its very concrete evidence. Since that time, the date of p52 has been in flux. There have been some debates about it, but most scholars still would say it is dated to the middle of the 1st century or significantly earlier. And here's a small piece of papyrus that is not all that significant for the original text of the New Testament, but it is very significant in terms of the dating of John's Gospel, as most scholars would look at it.